Hello, everyone. This is number 11 in my ongoing series on YouTube that I've just called for short Jesus Archaeology. And what we're doing in this series is taking textual evidence, primarily in the New Testament, but some outside, and archaeological or material evidence, whether on the ground, under the ground, artifacts, whatever we can dig up, whatever we can figure out 2,000 years later in terms of shedding light on the historical figure of Jesus. So we've come to the final days of Jesus, as I've called them. I've got something very special for you today. We're going to do a virtual video tour of Herod's temple in Jerusalem and place Jesus where we think he was in order to get a kind of a context of what was really happening and understand it better by being on the ground. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, final days of Jesus. I've divided it into 7 sections here. And last time we did Messianic Temple Takeover, as I called it. That was number 10. Take a look at it. If you didn't watch it, you'll find it very interesting. And I do propose in that episode the reason Jesus sealed his fate the first day that he went into the temple. And I'll refer back to that a little bit as we look at our virtual recreation today. Today, though, I'm going to focus on daily confrontations in Herod's temple. This would be after he enters the temple, stops the commerce, condemns the sacrificial system, and basically declares himself to be the Davidic Messiah, ready to take over for the kingdom of God with a huge crowd of supporters behind him. Now, traditionally, that was Palm Sunday. And what you then have is for the next several days, and we'll get into the chronology of the days as we go on, but for several days, according to the Gospel of Mark, which kind of gives a countdown, you get daily confrontations in Herod's temple. And here would be his view coming down the Mount of Olives. He would be headed, this is actually going west, looking at the temple and the compound area of this huge edifice that Herod built. This is the Roman fortress Antonia, where the Romans could overlook the activities of the temple, then the temple itself and its various courtyards, and then this portico area that we'll also talk about. So Jesus would have come down the southern path of the Mount of Olives and come around and then up probably from the south and entered in. Here's more of an aerial view, what you would have seen as you began to come down the Mount of Olives, because it's actually quite steep. Over here is Herod's palace, which is going to play into our story very heavily as we go along. And you can see some of the courtyards, and we're going to examine them very carefully as we go on. So here we have a breakdown of the different controversies and teachings of Jesus, all of them in the temple itself over the next few days following his confrontation of the authorities the day before when he comes down the Mount of Olives riding a donkey, goes into the temple and essentially shuts it down and declares it to be corrupt and full of violence and not in keeping in any way with God's ideal. So what does he ask? It's pretty obvious he would be asked this by his enemies. By what authority are you doing these things? The things you did yesterday. Who gave you the right to make these kinds of declarations? And, you know, he answers a question with a question. We joke about that's a very Jewish thing to do. And of course, Jesus was Jewish. I'll tell you, if you tell me by what authority did John the Baptist come and baptize, and was he of God or was he just an upstart, one of these crazy prophets that claims to be somebody when he's really nothing? And they won't answer because they'd rejected John. Jesus had accepted John and worked with him. Remember, we've covered all of that very closely. And the people consider John to be very holy and very great. And so they won't answer. Then he gives them a story about some wicked tenants that are managing a vineyard and they totally mismanage it. And then he basically says, what is the owner of the vineyard going to do? Referring back, obviously, to the previous day, the temple's like a vineyard. And the answer is he's going to come and put them out of business. So Jesus here is really turning up the heat and basically saying, you people are going to get evicted, and this house that has become a den of violence and a den of bloodshed is going to become a house of prayer for all peoples. I believe he thinks he's the Davidic Messiah. He believes that with God on his side, the current temple establishment will be overthrown and the kingdom of God will be realized. They then challenge him to try to get him in trouble with the Romans. What about paying taxes? It's kind of a double-edged question, because if he says, yes, pay taxes to the Romans, what is he supporting Roman rule? That's not a popular thing. But if he says, nah, don't pay the taxes, which Judas the Galilean, for example, had done in the year 6 CE, as Jesus was growing up as a kid, he would have been very familiar with that revolt. And he said, don't pay taxes. And a full scale revolt broke out. And then Jesus gave his famous answer, asked somebody to pull out a coin, and he said, whose image is on the coin? And everybody answered, Caesar. You know the story probably. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that belong to God. Now, notice the context is very important. He's in the temple. So he's essentially saying, outside is up to the Romans. That's their business. But here in the temple, we need to be concerned with the things of God, not with money and commerce. Then he gets questioned about whether he believes in resurrection of the dead. This is a question from the Sadducees challenging Jesus, not so much on paying taxes, but religious belief. Do you believe in all of these ideas about resurrection of the dead, final judgment, new creation, the world to come as it came to be called? And Jesus addresses that. It's an interesting thing. You can read it. Then he's asked by a scribe that you might think would be an enemy, what's the first and greatest commandment? And he answers that. And then he asks a question, very interesting. It's his turn. And he says, how many of you think the Messiah is a descendant of David? And if just about everybody nods, well, of course, everybody knows that. And then he asks them a question about that, that in effect says, how can that be? Because David looks to a future Messiah and considers him to be a Lord or a master. And why would David call him master? In other words, he's hinting that the final Davidic Messiah, which I think he thinks he is not just one more Davidic ruler as rulers in the past, but is one who's finally going to bring in the kingdom of God with his entourage. Remember, this all goes back to Daniel 7 and a vision that Daniel had about the Son of Man coming in the clouds and receiving judgment and then overthrowing all the powers of the world and setting up the kingdom of God, including Rome in this case. But what people often fail to notice is Son of Man is then interpreted in that chapter as the people of God. So it's not just Jesus, the Lone Ranger, the Messiah, overthrowing Rome and all the powers of heaven. So it's not just Jesus, the Lone Ranger, the hero, who's going to overthrow the powers of the world and set up the kingdom, but Jesus and his disciples and those who would ally with him that are going to face opposition and face suffering, whom God is going to deliver. But what's often overlooked in Daniel 7 is that Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven is not Jesus or any other messianic figure. It's interpreted in that chapter as the collective people of God. And so it's not just Jesus as Messiah, but his whole entourage, his disciples and followers that would band together with him and become rulers in the coming kingdom of God, with all the 12 tribes gathered together again and so forth, basically fulfilling Isaiah 11 and other texts that we've already looked at as well. We're going to see when he's on trial, he's asked about this, are you the Messiah? And he says, I am, but you'll see the Son of Man coming with power and glory, coming in his kingdom, as it says earlier in Mark. And so it's not just Jesus but it's the idea of a messianic group or assembly that's going to set up a new order. And that's what he's expecting. And then finally, the seventh event, a poor widow who offers all she has. She has three strikes against her. She's a woman, she's a widow with no man, and she doesn't have money. The three M's: not married, no man, no money. What do you do? And remember, she puts in the two little coins and and remember, she puts in the two tiny little coins that are about the size of and remember, she puts in the two little coins, the lepton, that are called widow's mites today after this story. And they're about a quarter of the size of an American dime. So very, very small, not worth hardly anything. And what does he say? This woman gave more than anyone else. So here's a diagram of the temple just to kind of orient you before we do our virtual tour and try to see where things happen. This is the south, this is the east, this is the west, and this is the north. So the Roman fortress, Antonia Fortress, is on the north. There's a pool here. This is the temple, of course. There are different gates and entrances, but the southern entrance that has this triple gate and double gate called the Hulda gates is really the main way people would enter coming up from the south, from the various pools that are in the southern part of the city as they undergo various kinds of ritual purification and then up into the temple. This area here is okay for Gentiles, as is this area, and then the whole portico area going all the way around. Once you cross this barrier that we'll see in a minute and go into this area, this is only the Jewish people or Israelites. And then as you go into other courts, we'll also see that you get a court of women, a court of Israelite men, finally, where only the priests go, and then, of course, the temple itself. So here's a wonderful aerial shot of the temple area today. And of course, this is the Haram. There's the Alaska Mosque. The Dome of the Rock is just to the right. But you can actually see the outline of where the temple was. And the foundations of these stones and these stones are the original from the time of Jesus, from Herod the Great. And these steps have now been excavated as well. We saw that last time. So the city went all the way down the Kidron Valley, cut across right here, and then came back around like this. So it was a huge 4-square area. Here's another shot that gives you an even broader view. And notice this is the Dead Sea. Right in the distance, you can faintly see it in the hills of Moab, or what is today Jordan. And there is the Temple Mount area. Look at that. You can still, the Antonio Fortress would have been right here. You can see how it fits the drawing. And the temple itself would have been here with its various courtyards. And some of this then inside as you go in today, even though the walls have been built up primarily in the Byzantine period and later periods, the Crusaders and then the Turkish period, but some of the Herodian features are still there, as we'll see. So you can barely see here the excavations beginning to uncover. This is the Western Wall where Jews pray, but remember, they're praying in the upper course of stones, taking you up to the top. But in the time of Jesus, they're 19 courses below. So people would be much lower when they were praying. Here's another shot. This gives you an even better shot. This is just such a wonderful picture because you can see Herod's temple compound. Jews are praying here at the Western Wall down at the foot. And then you've got excavations all around since 1967. So we actually know what it's like. And as you're going to see in a minute, this triple gate is still visible. It's all blocked up. But this is amazing. And essentially, the inner perimeters of the temple are still following the same outline that they did all the way back to the time of Jesus. Now, Herod's expansion of the temple, as it's called, was so vast and drastic that it almost could be called a third temple. And Herod began to create this great box, you might say, of massive stones all the way around with new gates. and all kinds of edifices that are pictured in this wonderful drawing by Lean Rittmeyer, whom I'll talk about later, all of his great work that he's done. So you begin to see how Herod is essentially taking down the temple and then rebuilding it. So in some ways, you could call it a third temple. Now, how big is this? 5 football fields from north to south. Can you imagine that? So if you started here and went up to here, 5 football fields and 3 across, just going from here to here. I always take my tours up there and we walk around and we see all these features, and you can still see some of the features from Herod's temple that have not been rebuilt or destroyed or covered over. Now, this is amazing. At the Israel Museum, outside, open air, you have a scale model built to scale of Jerusalem in the time of Herod the Great, Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. As you can see, you can walk around, take pictures, lean down, get good camera angles, make sure there's no people in the background. And it's just one of the best things we do. And this would be looking into that whole temple courtyard area. And once again, we're going to explore that. This is Herod's palace. This is Antonia Fortress, where the Romans could look over into this area. And this is the portico that goes all the way around. Now, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, it's utterly kind of leveled to the ground as much as you ever destroy a city. But those huge foundation stones largely remained, and many of them are still there today. People always ask, well, what didn't Jesus say in chapter 13 of Mark that not one stone would be left upon another? Well, if he's talking about the temple, that's true. There is no temple left at all. It's gone. And that golden dome of the rock, which is not a mosque, by the way, it's a shrine covering the holiness of Mount Moriah that goes all the way back in tradition, at least, to Abraham. But the foundation of the box does remain. And that's part of the buildings and so forth around. But essentially, as you can see in this recreation, there's not much left. It's essentially rubble. And then it was rebuilt by the Romans and turned into Aelia Capitolina, a city dedicated to Jupiter. Now, remember those steps? This is what the steps look like when you excavate them. And even though the Israelis have installed new steps over some of them so you won't wear out the old steps, you can walk on some of the original steps. And you can see the different courses of stone here and how they go up. And some of these, for example, this doorway here with its archway above it is from Herod's temple. It's still intact, sticking out there. And so it's really amazing to go and sit on these steps. You can see people here meditating and thinking. Many of them are Christian tourists. And this is one of the spots you can go to if you're interested in literally walking where Jesus walked. So it becomes a real important pilgrimage site. And notice bedrock, bedrock, bedrock. The steps are carved out of bedrock and went up into the temple. Here is the triple gate. And notice these stones right here in between and the archways are from the time of Jesus. They've been filled in and filled around, but those are Herodian stones in place from the time of Herod the Great. Isn't that amazing? And then, of course, you have other courses of stones built all the way up. And some of the lower stones are clearly from the temple in the time of Jesus, even though there's no longer the temple compound anymore. So I want to give credit to Lean Rittmeyer. Here's a link to his book. If you just go to my website, jamestabor.com, and type in /The Quest, it'll take you to this book on Amazon, and you can buy it. Highly, highly recommended. There's no book like this. This is the book you need. And then you can go to YouTube at Bible Scenes, and Jeremy Park has teamed up with Rittmeyer's input and created this virtual tour of the temple that I'm going to share with you now. So I want to give Lean and Jeremy credit. Lean has spent decades and decades excavating and studying this area. He's basically the expert. And Jeremy does such wonderful work. And he allows you to use these videos. He wants them to be spread. So I'm using this video with his permission, basically. Okay, so here's our virtual tour. There are the triple gates. There are the double gates. There are the steps going up, and we just saw the remnants of these steps. We think this is an area for ritual purity right here, some pools inside. And of course, look at this beautiful Herodian building. Now, if you go to Hebron, still today, to the tomb of the patriarchs, you can see the style Herod used to build such structures still intact because it wasn't destroyed. And that's how this is reconstructed. It's very close to how it must have looked. So, how many times did Jesus, we're talking about the historical Jesus, go up and down these steps, enter into these gates? They're called the Hulda gates. Some argue that it's named for a prophetess named Hulda in the Hebrew Bible, but Hulda also means a mouse or a burrowing animal. And in fact, when you go in these gates, you go through a kind of a tunnel and come up. And I think that maybe makes more sense. They're the tunnel gates, basically, the Hulda gates. And this is where all the crowds would come up from the south and enter Jerusalem. And on the day that Jesus took over the temple, remember, and closed it down for a day, we think the money changers and all the commerce and the animals are right inside once you go in and up, and we'll see that virtually. So this is actually a video, and we can watch it, and I'll stop it from time to time and talk as we go through. I love this so much. I hope you enjoy it. So we're going to go around. So that's the southern side of the temple. That's how you would go in. Now let's go up high and take a look. Look at this. And this wonderful pavilion that's built. And this is where you would come out right here. See this? So let's go back down inside. And it's not just a tunnel, it's a magnificent gate. And here, these are still visible today. This was not destroyed. And I'm going to pause it there and just talk about this. You know, in the book of Acts, the disciples, after Jesus is dead, we have a whole set of chapters in the early part of Acts where they go up to the temple to pray. They go up to the temple, they preach, they teach, and they're in the whole portico area. And one of the gates is called the Gate Beautiful. And many have suggested that this might be that gate. And there's a good story in the book of Acts you can look up. These are just extraordinary, and they show you something of the magnificence of even a gate. But wait till you see what's upstairs once you go back up, because we just came down. So let me continue here. We'll go on and see. This is how people would come into the temple. Picture crowds streaming in here. Now, this is going around the corner, and we've got Robinson's Arch. Robinson, Edward Robinson, an American explorer, archaeologist. It was named after him. He identified it. It's talked about in the literature. And here's the lower city. You can see the commerce and the shops. The Hulda gates go up through the lower area into the upper area. But when you come into this area, you basically have this palatial structure that Herod built that's Josephus says is maybe one of the most beautiful structures in the world. And we'll go inside in a minute as we come around. So there you get a virtual view. This is inside once you get in. And this would be where we think the money changers were, and all the commerce and pictured cages of animals and so forth. This is where they're going to sort everything out. This is where they're going to take the animals that people have brought in up the steps and examine them and so forth. And look how beautiful this is as we look at the ceiling and so forth. And this is referred to often in the New Testament and the Gospels. This would be where Jesus would also teach and preach over the next week. And you see how crowds would gather in these areas. So now we're going to go on. So now to the south, just to take a quick look at the Fortress Antonio, you've got the Roman camp inside. And here you have a very fortified area, almost impregnable. Nobody could get through this. And they've got a view of the whole area. Remember when Paul gets arrested in the book of Acts? He gets arrested and taken into that fortress up those steps. So I paused right here because this would be that outer court where anyone could go. But if you go past this low barrier here, it's just a warning. You can see it's easy to enter. But at each gate, there's a very stern warning sign, no Gentiles allowed upon penalty of death. And then you would have women and children and Israelites inside the inner court. And then this is the court of the women with the two lamp pillars up high there. And then there's the court of Israelite men. Women can go around the balcony, as you're going to see. And then finally, inside here is where the priests are and the sacrifices. So let's go up closer and take a look at this. As we come on down, we're going to see the warning that is there to warn everybody, don't go any further. Look at that. And here we have the warning in Greek. A portion of one of these signs or stones was discovered. It's now in Turkey because it was found under the Ottoman rule, but Israel has tried to get it back and maybe they will someday. Remember, Paul is accused of bringing a Gentile past the barrier. That's how he gets arrested and causes a riot in the temple, and also why he ends up fleeing to Nero, Caesar, and ending up in Rome, according to the book of Acts. Okay, this is the court of the women. It's the next court once you go inside, and it's got these wonderful bronze doors, and you have these four lamps. Josephus describes all this. And at certain times of the year, depending on festivals and holidays and so forth, if men are here separated from the women can be up here and still watch the activities down below. So let's watch that as we go further in. And underneath, you've got this beautiful tiled area, and some of these tiles have been found, and so we actually know the pattern. That's the court of women, as it's called. It really just means the court of mixed groups. Those women can go there as well. But you also have these offering boxes. There are 13 of them, according to our records historically. And that's where Jesus would have seen the woman drop in her 2 copper coins right here into one of these. So they were gathered inside this area when he was teaching and being questioned and so forth. So we can begin to picture what it looks like as we go on. This is really an amazing video. Thank you, Jeremy, for doing this. And there's the other offerings. People are coming in, they're leaving their money. You got to picture processions coming in, people announcing loudly, and now the delegation from Corinth has arrived with all of their many gifts for the temple. And they would be bringing all their silver and their gold. And remember, they got to convert it into the Tyrian shekels. So you're going to see the silver coins dropping down in, and it gives you the setting. And Jesus observes that, and he says to his disciples, did you see that woman, what she just gave? It didn't make a big clank noise, did it? Wasn't a whole bag of coins going down in. And he said, she gave more than anybody here today. One of his most famous teachings. Very important for understanding the agenda of Jesus in terms of what is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you poor. Blessed are the meek and those that are persecuted and being downtrodden and oppressed. So this gives you the kind of scene that you can imagine that happening. And then we go through these wonderful bronze doors. They're made of Corinthian bronze, very expensive. And these huge doors open up from the main court where women are also allowed. And it opens up into the area where the sacrifices are brought. Now we're going to go up in our drone and we're going to get an overview of the whole area that we just talked about. I hope you can orient yourself a little bit. Looking south there, you see the portico going all the way around. And there's the Mount of Olives facing east. And this would be facing north, where you're going to see the fortress again. And we go all the way around. And you can see the upper city behind. So that's the tour. I hope that helps you to imagine a little bit more of what went on. Sometimes, if you can get a picture of the setting where something happened and what it would have been like, it helps you to read the stories. So, read chapter 11 and chapter 12 of Mark and take a look at the video. You can go back and rerun it and begin to imagine where all these activities took place. So next time we'll go on with our further events during the week. After a week of activities, Jesus finally makes his declaration about the widow. Then they go out on the Mount of Olives. And in chapter 13 of Mark, as they exit that temple area and go back up the Mount of Olives and look back at the buildings and how wonderful they are, you get more of an idea now. And the disciples say, "Look, Master, what lovely buildings," as if to say, "I can't wait till we take over." And then Jesus begins to say, "Do you see all these things? It's all going to come down." So, one of the dilemmas that scholars face, and there's a lot of disagreement about this, is whether Jesus expected that whole Herodian temple to be leveled, not one stone upon another, or was that put into his mouth after the fact to make him like a prophet? And Mark was writing that and composing it as a way of saying Jesus anticipated the destruction of the temple. So there are two views. The majority opinion, I think, is the idea that he doesn't really anticipate that the temple is going to be destroyed. He wants to take over the temple and purify it and turn it into a house of prayer for all people. But there's also the view that he studied Daniel 9, which talks about a ruler who's going to come and set up the desolating sacrilege and destroy the city and the sanctuary. But what that meant as Jesus spoke it, destroy the city and the sanctuary, does that mean literally down to the ground as it was in 70? Or did he have more in mind a defilement of the temple, but then its purification as in the days of the Maccabees? So take care, everybody. Next time, we'll continue on with the evening meal. So after the week of going in and out of the temple, Jesus plans a special private meal. We think we know where it was. We think we might even know the building and the foundations, at least, of the building in which that meeting was held. The Last Supper, as it came to be called. See you later.